Oxford.
The first overland.
This is Oxford, a car that simply refuses to die. It's a living piece of history. It carried 6 men across varying terrain over 18,000 miles. It has survived deserts, jungles, mountain passes. It has been battered by time, but it has never been broken. In 1955, Oxford carried the hopes of a generation. The first overland was more than just a journey. It was a leap into the unknown, a chance to prove that nothing could stand in the way of human determination. But over 60 years later, Oxford wasn't yet finished. The world had changed, but the spirit of adventure hadn't diminished. I sat down with a man who put his trust in Oxford and took it on another adventure. Alex Bescoby knew one more chapter was left for this faithful Land Rover. Together, Alex and his team, including Nat George, who is Tim Slessor's grandson, set off from Singapore to London on what was dubbed the Last Overland. Through new challenges, different roads, and unfamiliar faces, one thing remained constant. Oxford, still moving, still enduring, still personifying the spirit of adventure. Oxford isn't just a vehicle, it's a symbol of resilience, of 2 generations bound by one car, 2 routes between London and Singapore, and the allure of overlanding. More than the story of the first and the last overland, this is a story of a landy called Oxford, a car that refuses to die. Alex Bescoby is the man behind the Last Overland. The seemingly preposterous idea of driving a 64-year-old car from Singapore to London just because it has done the trip from London to Singapore in 1955. So Alex, how did the whole idea of the Last Overland come about?
I like the description of preposterous.
Yeah.
I think that is a good word for it. The Last Overland came about because I'd grown up with the story of the First Overland, and the idea of recreating history's greatest road trip was something that I just couldn't resist. The idea of taking that same car and taking it across the same road 65 years later, irresistible.
Right. So you spent a considerable amount of time with Tim Slessor and you've almost memorized his book, The First Overland. But how was it to actually hear him talk about the First Overland?
Really special. And I think, the further away I get from the journey, the more lucky I feel about that. Because obviously I had his book, you've read his book, many people have read his book, it's a wonderful book. But to be able to call him up and say, okay, what was actually going on here? And a living diary, of that experience. And I was also really lucky to have his actual diaries from the journey. So
the raw footage,
yeah,
as you say.
And
okay.
so we had the diaries, 3 huge volumes of diaries that, every day. And he hadn't read them since the 50s. So I was reading them and phoning him and saying, do you remember this? And he said, I had completely forgotten that, 65 years later. So I was very lucky because I'm a historian. My first love is history. So you always go back to the sources. And I was able to speak to the original source when I was talking about the First Overland.
And I remember in your book you speak about how his house became a sort of war room, right? So to speak. And you'd have these maps on the floor, and he was very keen on going through the stans.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the 1950s, because of the Iron Curtain and the way the world was, the political scenario of the world at that time, he couldn't go through the stans.
Yeah.
But he could go through places like Syria and Afghanistan, Iraq, and stuff, which you couldn't do just now. But the original plan was to have Tim Slessor with you drive back, and he was very keen on going through the stans, right?
The biggest difference between the original journey from the 50s and ours in 2019 was the Middle East, which back in the 50s was a really peaceful place. Obviously now a very different place. And the whole of Central Asia was part of the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain, as you say. China was still very much emerging from a civil war. So the biggest difference between our journey and the original journey was that we had to take this massive detour around the Middle East, which actually was a huge opportunity because Tim was incredibly excited to go to a big part of the world that he'd never been to. So I say China, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Amazing how different the world looked between 1955 and 2019. And we were able to take this beautiful old car to some completely new territory. And that for us was, brilliant.
Yeah, so coming to the car, okay, cars that are 64 years old are usually kept running for exhibitions or for classic car rallies. They're really showboats, okay?
Yeah.
They're not
Working cars.
they don't have a purpose anymore, right? So how did you convince yourself that this car would do this 21,000 kilometer journey?
Well, it had done it before, so why not? I mean, I think it's a testament to British engineering that, almost 70 years on, this car that was designed in 1947, the same year as Indian independence, that it's still running in 2019. I mean, that's incredible. It's, I guess the genius is that it's so simple in a way. But you said there, about that cars like this are often museum pieces or they're showboats. I think the beautiful thing about Oxford, which I know you've now met again since, reunion in 5 years. The beautiful thing about Oxford is that it was restored precisely to be driven. Adam Bennett, the guy that rescued it from Centolina in the South Atlantic, his goal in, paying all that money and all that time to get that car working was precisely not to be sat in a museum. This car was designed to be driven, and it hasn't stopped moving since we drove on the last Overland. It's an amazing thing.
I think the fact that Land Rover was so hardy and tough and reliable was recognized by the Tatas when they bought the company. Land
and when
Rover.
we were driving through India, I mean, one of my highlights, and they call Northeast India the land of the Land Rovers, right? I mean, we were in Manibanjang in West Bengal. We were going, through Nagaland, Assam, and the number of Series 1 Land Rovers I saw that were still working. I mean, they were on the tea plantations in Assam, or it was a credit to the car, I think.
In the book, you mentioned how you were exposed to the elements during the trip, thanks to Oxford's poor insulation and waterproofing. And I'm sure you knew you'd face a whole gamut of weather conditions. So why didn't you modify the old girl a bit?
Funnily enough, it's just started raining now. Welcome to London.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of being in Oxford in West Bengal, to be honest. I think modifying, where's the fun in that? At the end of the day, I said my passion is history. I wanted to recreate history's greatest road trip. A big part of the experience is feeling what it would have been like to drive a car in the 1950s. And there's no aircon, right? There's no insulation, there's no heating. The windscreen wipers work just about, no disc brakes, no synchromesh gearbox. This thing is basic. And I think the beauty of doing a journey in a classic car is that you are so present in the moment because you're constantly worried about, am I in the right gear? The engine's making a funny noise. Is the roof about to fall off? Are the wheels about to fall off? You cannot listen to a podcast. You can't chat to your friends. You're in the moment.
And that's the beauty of it.
That's the beauty of a road trip, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
great.
You're a biker, first
I know.
and foremost. You can't listen to the radio, you can't speak to friends, you're there. And that is actually the beauty of the journey.
Your book talks about how the Oxford was treated like a celebrity and almost with the awe afforded to a holy ghost resurrected from the past. How was it to drive through northeast of India, especially Darjeeling, where Land Rovers are a religion?
That was the best part of the journey. As anywhere I drive that car, people smile. And the biggest privilege of doing that journey, and even now when I take Oxford around the UK or whatever, people just go, wow, tell me the story. But in Northeast India, they already knew the story. Our guide through Northeast India, Rajan, he turned up on the border between Myanmar and India in Manipur with the first edition copy of the First Overland. He knew the story, and so many people in Northeast India knew the story. So for us, we were just carrying this this relic, through India, and that was so special. But one of the greatest privileges of the whole journey, and you'll know this, from your stories, is that whenever you drive in a classic Land Rover, you'll meet people who want to tell you their story. So you stop and people go, "Hey, my dad had one of these. My uncle, my granddad, my great granddad, and I learned to drive in one of these things." And all of a sudden, in the journey, you become a mirror for other people's memories, and that's a wonderful thing.
So then you crossed into Nepal, that was great, but then you had to get into Tibet, right? Tibet. So from the times of Francis Younghusband and George Mallory, Tibet has been the Forbidden Kingdom, and in a sense, it yet is, given the fact how cagey the Chinese are about foreigners traveling through it. In fact, our chance meeting was when we arrived at Kirong on the same day in October 2019. How was it to drive through Tibet and Aksai Chin? From your book, it comes across that there was a constant sense of uneasiness.
I think, well, you and I met there. I think you understand the paperwork that's involved to get in there, and I think you understand the politics,
Yes.
which are complex. And I found that we were kept waiting at the border for 2 weeks to get in. So when I saw you, we'd been a long old ride to get there. But there was a sense of political uneasiness. But in terms of sheer awe of the natural environment, Tibet is like nothing I've ever seen. And I remember you and I driving through there. We looked like tiny toys.
That's
You
right.
on your motorbike, me in my car.
Yeah.
Tiny
I know.
toys
And with the Everest over there.
in the background.
Yeah.
Unforgettable.
And how was it? How was it through the Silk Route?
That was a dream come true. And I know you've done that road as well. And I think the thing that I love about that, again, as a historian, is that road that takes you from Western China to all the way through to Turkey, to Istanbul, that was the center of the world
Really?
for centuries. It was the home of language, faith, culture. This island was on the edge of the world. It was nothing. It was not important at all. Everything that was important in the sort of 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century happened there on that Silk Road. And it's amazing to remember that Kashgar in Western China is closer to Istanbul than it is to Beijing. That just shows you how enormous China is, but it shows you how fundamental that road is, that Silk Road, still today.
Right. So, and how did Oxford behave? I know you had a breakdown in Tajikistan, right?
Turkmenistan. Well, it broke down everywhere.
Yeah.
But we had a catastrophic breakdown in Turkmenistan when I was driving at about 60 miles an hour, which is the top speed. And the back wheel fell off when I was driving full speed. And we only managed to stop because the back axle dragged a groove down the tarmac. So it was terrifying. I'm glad it happened there and not in Darjeeling.
Yeah, I can imagine you gone off the the hill, right? So I know after Turkey it was Europe and that was the home run, right? So when did you start feeling that all right, I've come home, you know what I mean? Or did you feel that only when you arrived in England, or did you think that okay, now Turkey's done and I'm in my home country? Did you actually feel the crossing over, being a Britisher, being from Europe? Did you feel that once you crossed over from Asia into Europe, you're home? Or
well, that was, I'll be honest, the first time I celebrated was Istanbul on the European side.
Yes.
Because I thought that China is done, Turkmenistan is done, the border of Afghanistan is done. If we wanted to, we could probably drive through the night and be home in 3 days. And yeah, that was the moment where I thought, okay, we might be late, but we're going to be alive.
Okay.
To be honest.
So the seed of the idea was sown when you went to the Land Rover meet in Anglesey in Wales with your father, who is a Land Rover Africanando. And do you think that events like these where like minds gather enthuse and inspire people to do stuff like this? Were you like, for example, Generation Speed in India, do you think it will create an atmosphere where Indians would want to go out and do road trips?
I think Generation Speed, the idea of it as a meeting place, is genius. My journey began by going to a meeting just like Generation Speed
Okay.
on a beach in Wales,
All right.
where there was no agenda. It was just, let's enjoy great stories, great cars, great journeys. And every journey has to start somewhere. And I think, that's saying that you are a reflection of the 5 people you spend the most time with, right? So why not spend time with people who love cars, who love overland journeys, and who knows what will happen?
That's true.
I think it's going to be wonderful.
So Alex, in conclusion, okay, what's your if you were to give somebody one bit of essential advice about doing a long road trip like the one you did from Singapore to London, what would it be?
I'm not going to give you a practical answer.
Okay.
I would say that enjoy the journey, because that is all it's about. The destination is irrelevant.
Right.
Be there, be present, because when you get home, you'll realize how special that was.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, mate.